It's almost like you're working a full-time job and you're putting full-time effort into something and getting almost no returns. But eventually being the key word, it starts to shift. I would say it probably took me at least 4 years before I technically made more money than I did at my old job. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, probably my favorite one we've done so far here. Number 95, the 5 steps to get really good at sales. I was on a podcast yesterday and they were asking me about what is something you would tell somebody early on in business, like the one tip. And it was really learn sales because it's going to be very beneficial for you in the long run. And that starts by rebuilding your relationship with it. So today, for episode number 96, kind of going hand in hand or connected to what we talked about last week, why you shouldn't quit your job to podcast yet. One of the reasons people like to have me on their podcast is because I think I have a pretty cool story. Now, debating suicide and having really bad depression and anxiety and all that obviously isn't positive, but it makes for a really impactful story where I found success. I realized success wasn't success in my eyes. I ended up going very far down, quit my job to start this journey, and then here we are 7 years and 1,700 episodes later and all that happy jazz. But one of the pieces for me in my story is I was very unhappy at my job, and I ended up leaving my job and going all into what we do today. Sounds awesome. Except in the first couple years, it was absolutely brutal. It was terrible. It was challenging. I was broker than broke. I was suffering. I was struggling. It wasn't great. If I could go back and change the way I did it, would I? I don't know. But I do want to create the opportunity for you to make a more informed decision. So why you shouldn't quit your job to podcast yet? I guess a couple points. One, it's probably going to take you longer than you expect to make a meaningful amount of money. So that's one thought, and we can kind of dig into that after if you want. Here's the ultimate thought. The framework, the tactic, the strategy, whatever. The example. Your podcast is most likely going to be a long-term moneymaker. What I mean by that is, in the first year, the second year, the third year, you might not make that much money. But if you podcast for 15 years, and I know that probably sounds wild because 15 years is a really long time, you can make a lot of money down the line, but it's probably not going to happen in the beginning. What ideally you would have is you would have some form of recurring, predictable income that you can live off of while you build the podcast. So this is actually very timely. You're listening to this on Friday. Wednesday. So Wednesday of this week, Next Level You crossed 1 million listens. And we actually, the same day, crossed $1 million. So in 7 years, and I guess 5 years of doing this full time, we have crossed 1 million listens, and we have crossed $1 million in the business. We've made $1 million and we've gotten 1 million listens. But that took 7 years. And that took 5 years of full-time grinding. If you can't stick it out for 5 years, if you can't stick it out for 2 years, it might not be sustainable. What I don't want to happen is for you to say, I love this podcasting thing. I'm going to quit my job, and in 2 months, I'm going to be able to replace my income that I was making from my job. If you're making $50,000 a year from your job, and you leave your job to be a full-time podcaster, you lose all of your insurance, you lose all of your benefits, you lose all of your retirement, you lose all that stuff, and you lose the certainty of having recurring steady income. So I think the best case would be you stay at your job until your podcast is producing some level of income, some level of recurring income, some level of predictable income. Because what happens for a lot of us is we fall in love with podcasting and we want to go all in, but then we realize, well, this is way harder than I thought to make money. And I don't know, maybe I'm on the opposite end of what a lot of people say. I'm never going to be the guy who tells people to quit their job and go all in on podcasting because you can make a boatload of money, because I think it's harder than most people admit. That's been my experience. We're a very successful, quote unquote, business now, but it's been a challenge. It has been a challenge. And I did not know what I was in for in the very beginning of this. Alan asked me the other day, he said, if you could go back knowing what you know now, would you have done it? And I said, I don't know. I probably wouldn't have done it the same way I did, because I thought we were going to make money faster. And we didn't make money for the first couple of years at least. So in theory, I think the most comfortable, the most safe, the most practical way to do it is to stay at the place that is paying you a recurring, predictable amount of money while you build your podcast on the side. And then ultimately, let's say you're putting 40 hours into job one. I don't want to say real job. Let's say you're putting 40 hours into professional job, and then you're putting 10 hours a week into side hustle, which is the podcast. Then maybe it goes to 40 hours and then 20 hours. And then maybe it goes 30 hours and then 20 hours because you're making more money. And then maybe it's 20 hours, 30 hours. And then you can kind of see how that starts to transition from, okay, I was making $5,000 a month at my job. Now I'm making $5,000 a month at my job, and I'm making $1,000 a month with the podcast. All right, I'm making $5,000 a month with my job. Now I'm making $3,500 a month with the podcast. If I got really stingy with the way I'm living, I could live off of that money. And again, this is all hypothetical, right? It depends on where you live. It depends on a lot of things. Then you could start exploring, what would it be like for me to leave my job? Well, how much is insurance? How much is that going to cost? All right, what happens if I pull out of my 401k and all that happy jazz? And trust me, I don't know the answer to all those things. But the ultimate thought is, when your side hustle podcast, whatever the side hustle is, right? In this case, it's a podcast, can replace your recurring predictable income, or at least get close, that's a time where you can start experimenting. But what I've found with a lot of people is they have this. What's a good example of this? One of our clients is someone who is very successful in the health space. They're a doctor. They had a very, very successful practice, and they made a lot of money. They were very, very, very financially free. They were able to run the podcast for years and years and years before they made money, because they had predictable income coming in. Then eventually they got to the place where they were able to leverage the podcast, where they could make enough money to potentially leave that thing. Now, they ended up selling it, so things different. And realistically, they're not making the same amount of money they were making when they were doing their real job. Far less, but it's okay because they have a nest egg and it's enough to live off. What's another great example? One of our other clients is a fitness coach, a health coach, a nutrition coach. He has a really good job. And on the side, he's building up the coaching, group coaching, membership side of things with his podcast. He's not at the place where he could leave his full-time job and be comfortable / survive. But if he does this long enough, another year, another 2 years, if it continues to trend in the right direction, he could potentially replace his income. But that's the hard thing, is it kind of sucks in the meantime. It's almost like you're working a full-time job and you're putting full-time effort into something and getting almost no returns. But eventually being the key word, it starts to shift. I would say it probably took me at least 4 years before I technically made more money than I did at my old job. 4 years is a long time. And this is the other thing, the other side of things is, if you stay at your job, are you able to delegate some of the stuff that you don't want to do that will ultimately allow you to do the podcast for longer?
Hi, my name's John Laurito, and I just wanted to give a big shout out to Kevin Palmieri. I had reached out to him. He had been referred to me when I had shared with a friend of mine some interest in doing a podcast, and he said, you've got to use Kevin, he's fantastic. He's the best around. He'll get you started and off the ground and soaring high. Kevin was phenomenal in terms of leading me through the whole process, and not just easy to work with, but really, really knows his stuff. So whether you're looking for somebody to help you and get you started, or somebody, as I've done, where I'm putting it entirely in his hands because I've got total trust and confidence in him, any of those ends of the spectrum, you're going to have a lot of success and a lot of fun working with Kevin. Trust me. Thanks.
Alan and I had a conversation today about a podcast that we were working with who's now a business client of Alan's. And this person has a membership on their website, and I believe it's like $50 a month. And I think they have 104 people. So they're getting $5,000 a month from that, passive, quote unquote. But they've been doing a live call every single week in their space. They're in kind of the therapy counseling space. They've been doing a live call every single week for 15 years. Now they have the opportunity to get 100 people recurring to pay $50 a month or whatever it may be, right? Maybe $1,000 course, whatever. The reason they have so much demand is because they've been doing it for so long, right? That's why. Now, luckily, their job is very much connected to what they're doing, so it's all aligned. But it's really hard to get it going unless you already have a lot of experience, because this is where it kind of crosses over. Unless you already have a lot of experience in something. So let's say somebody who is a very, very successful business owner wants to start a podcast about how to build businesses. That might be different because they already have all the momentum of what they were doing before. But if you're a doctor who's going to do a podcast on something that is not related to your expertise, it doesn't necessarily carry over at the same degree, right? So the one takeaway, if you could only take one thing away from this episode, here's my thought. You want to have two things going at the same time. You want to have one thing that you're building for the long term, which is ultimately going to be the podcast, and you want to have one thing that is making you money in the short term that you can invest in the long term. That's the ultimate goal. And I realize I say ultimate goal often, especially on this show, but I think that's really what it is. Problem is, if you leave your job too soon, you run out of money, or you become too scarce and you can't make long-term decisions, and then you got to go find a new job, and then maybe you don't think you could be a podcaster. That's one thought. You just run out of money. We don't want that to happen, obviously. The other thought is you leave your job and then you have to do things in a very constricted way. You don't have the opportunity to let the sales cycle play out the way it should. You don't have the opportunity to level up your podcast, to get on other shows, to build a Facebook group, to do all that stuff. And you just don't have enough time in it. And then you think you can't do it. I would much rather you go slower for 5 years than go super fast for one. Because if you're around in 5 years, I'm telling you, you're going to have opportunities as long as you're focused on improvement. You got to be focused on improving a little bit every time as you go. If you're focused on improvement, you're going to have opportunities the longer you do this. We've gotten speeches that just came to us because of amazing listeners of our podcast. And we've made thousands of dollars speaking. Awesome. But if that was what we started this for, and in the first year we expected that to happen, we would have been in trouble. And I would say we made money compared to most of the podcasts that I've worked with, especially the ones where they've been around for a year or two and then I start working with them. We made money pretty quickly, all things considered. So I'm not telling you can't make money with your podcast quickly. What I'm saying is it probably will not be enough to replace your income. But that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't keep doing what you're doing. That's my real thought with this. There's a lot of people on social media saying, if you don't get this, you're bad. We can help you get to this. We can help you make this amount of money. Most of that's BS. I'm telling you, as someone who has a company built around podcasting and it has a company who helps podcasters, it's harder than most people think. It just is. And I will never tell you otherwise because I don't think that'll serve you. I don't think telling you, yes, this is easy, and if you buy this thing, it's going to help, and it's going to get you this and this result. Coaching will help. Yes. If you don't like producing your own show, hiring someone to produce your show will help. It's ultimately going to buy you more time to do the things that you should be doing to grow the podcast and the business. But it's challenging. That's why so many shows only make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 to 21 episodes is the unfortunate space where a lot of podcasts die. Because that's when the crap kind of hits the fan. But my thought is, if you had a full-time job that was paying you money every single week, and the podcast was a very fun hobby that you were focused on growing and scaling and learning more about and getting better at, but you had the financial abundance to keep going, I'm willing to bet you'd be more successful that way. Unless you're somebody who thrives under pressure, maybe the other way is for you. But I've seen a lot of people try to do that, and it just doesn't work for them because I think everything takes longer than we think. This is something I've come to over time. A lot of things, when I think back, when I was thinking of how long it was going to take, I thought, how long did I want it to take, not how long will it actually take. It was convenient for me to say, yeah, we'll probably make money in the first year. It shouldn't be a problem. That's how fast I wanted it to happen. That was not how fast it was going to happen. Now, knowing what I know now, yes, I could do things differently, right? But at the time, I didn't know. So let's land this plane that we're flying around in right now. Have two things. Have one thing that pays the bills in the short run while you build the thing that you want to pay more of the bills eventually. A podcast can be very, very, very lucrative in time. I'm making more money now with a podcast than I ever made at jobs before. But that took years and years and years, and something had to fund the podcast growth. Now, luckily, we figured out coaching pretty early on, and we happened to be good at what we did, and we happened to be pretty good at sales and building communities. That just won't be the case for everyone. So if you have a job that you don't hate, stick it out and really focus on growth with your show and see what happens. And eventually, if you're making the same amount of money with a podcast as you're making with your job, stash money, stay there for as long as you can, and then form an exit strategy. But until then, I would say it's fairly reckless to leave your job to podcast full-time unless you have some level of full-time results. Now, again, it's not sexy. It's not going to go viral, that type of thinking. But I also realize that most people need more accurate feedback, more accurate advice. And sometimes the advice that is the least sexy is the most valuable. And I genuinely think this is one of those times. So that's my 2 cents. You do whatever you feel is best for you and your growth and your journey, but it doesn't have to be a rush. We had a mentor one time who said the most important part of business is staying in business. And the podcast is no different. Something Alan and I say very often is just survive. It's outlast. If we're here in 10 years, statistically, the vast majority of shows are not going to be here in 10 years. Most of the shows are not going to be in 10 years if you think about it. If we're here, that already buys us a bigger audience. If Podcast Growth U is around in 5 years, which it will be, and there's only 10 other shows that have been around for 6 years or 7 years, that's going to bring a certain level of audience. And it's the same for you. Now, I'm not saying if you do it for 10 years, you're guaranteed to be the best show in the world. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that if you only do it for 3 episodes, you're not going to be. So again, take that for what you will, run that through your filter and see how it lands. But that is the advice I would give. What are we going to talk about next week? Next week, I want to talk about which categories are the most saturated. So when you are putting your show up on Buzzsprout or Libsyn or whatever podcast host you're using, you get to choose what category, what genre your show is. And obviously, there are pros and cons of whatever your genre is. But I want to talk about which ones are the most saturated because that matters a ton in the grand scheme of things. And I don't think a lot of people think about that when they're doing their show. So we're going to talk about that next week. If you want to hop on a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session, link will be in the show notes as always. Again, I'm not going to try to sell you on anything other than what you want to learn. I want to help as much as humanly possible. That's always the goal. So if you're interested, link will be in the show notes. What do I hope for you this week? I just hope you're feeling more confident, and I hope you're feeling more clear. Whether it's coming from me or other resources that you're finding on the internet or just doing podcasting, I hope you're starting to have a more clear, certain vision, because I know how good that feels. I know how good it feels when you sit down and say, oh, this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it like this and like this and like this, and then this is the result I'm hoping for. That's what I hope for each and every one of you. That's what I want this podcast to be. So, yeah, that's what I hope. A couple exciting-ish announcements. I would say Q3 or Q4 of this year, I will have a Facebook group for sure. I'm also going to work on writing a book. So Alan suggests that I do it, and I don't want to, but I do know it's important. The reason I don't want to is because I'm not a writer. I don't really enjoy writing. But I do know that if there was a book on podcasting early on, I definitely would have gotten it, and it would have been very, very beneficial. So at some point this year, we will have a Facebook group for Podcast Growth University, and we will also have some form of a book / hopefully audiobook. I don't know how that works yet, but just wanted to throw that out there. You're the first to know that because nobody else knows that yet. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. And yeah, I'm excited to bring that to you. Until next week, keep on crushing it, keep on podcasting, and we will talk to you all then.